In today's episode of Children of Heroes, we headed to the southwest outskirts of London to Kingston, where we interviewed Deborah Shurmer, daughter of Sergeant Anton Haas.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father escaped from Czechoslovakia after the occupation and later joined the British military intelligence. What did he do before the war?
Before the war, he did an apprenticeship for a woolen mill that was based in Brno, and that was owned by his uncle, part owned by his uncle. So he managed to learn all the different phases of production for wool, and that ended up being his profession throughout his life. And then after he did his apprenticeship, he joined the 2nd Regiment of the Siberian Dragoons in the cavalry. He was doing that in 1938. And there was a feeling that an invasion was imminent. So in preparation for the invasion, with others, they went to collect horses from northern Moravia to prepare. But when he got back to barracks, the sergeant major said, "You may as well give me your pistol, it's all over." Because at that time then the Munich Agreement was signed with France, Italy, Germany and Great Britain. And so they knew that they couldn't actually protect Czechoslovakia, that Hitler had the right to move into the Sudetenland and would control the tank production and the divisions. This, of course, was very distressing for my father and everyone he was with. He tells a story of sitting on a bale of oats, thinking about what he was going to do for 2 days. 15th of March 1939, he could see smoke rising from his house where he was, and it was the synagogue that was burning in Olomouc. And he knew that the invasion had progressed and the Jews in Olomouc were at risk. He talked to his parents about what they should plan to do. They call it bush telegraph. All their friends and acquaintances discussed what to do. They pooled all their resources, and he managed to get a passport, an exit visa. He planned the boat trip from Hamburg to Cuba. So his family made sure he had enough money. They made sure that the British Aid Association for Jews had £100 ready for him when he needed it. So on the 9th of May 1939, he took a train from Prague, had to say goodbye to his parents, not realising that would be the last time he would see them. And now, later on in life, he told of a story how he regretted having to leave them. He wished he had persuaded them to go with him, so that his parents stayed in Olomouc and said when he settles somewhere else, they'll join him, but that was never to be. So he left the train from Prague to Berlin and was met by his Uncle Arthur, who lived in an area called Grunenwald in Berlin. And when he arrived, he was to stay with him for a few days, and his uncle took him on a car ride around Berlin so that he could see the swastikas that were displayed by the Third Reich. And he found this very scary, to be in Berlin in that situation. And then on the 12th of May, he took a train from Berlin to Hamburg, and he had to get a certificate of good conduct to give to the Germans, which enabled him to get on the ship. So on the 13th of May, he embarked on the MS St. Louis. This was a Hamburg American ship, and there has actually been a film and a book covering the story of these émigrés leaving Berlin to reach Cuba. And there's a picture of my father here on the boat with people he met. Many of the people came from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hitler had arranged that they would release these prisoners from concentration camps, and it was all part of a propaganda plan that would make him look like he was caring, and these passengers could leave. So they left, but on their arrival at Cuba, the authorities announced that the visas that they had that were issued by the Cuban authorities weren't valid. So they sent gunboats to push the ship back out to sea. And at this point, my father sent a telegraph to his parents saying, heading to Southampton, secure embarking. So they realised what was happening and contacted some family friends in the UK, in London. They were called the Fishers, and they guaranteed his entry, and the British aid organisation, Jewish aid organisation, had £100 there for him. After that journey, for his perspective, that was a miracle that he got out. So after he's a refugee in Britain, but the one thing which was the last straw for him was that the British impounded the £100 that he'd miraculously kept until then with him. So he had nothing, and he had to go to the Jewish refugee organisation to give him the money for a train to Huddersfield. Fortunately for him, he knew of a Czech family who had moved their woolen trade to Huddersfield, and so the family were in contact, and so he got on a train to Huddersfield, met them, and started working in Huddersfield in the woolen trade. So there he settled down. He was very happy to be in Britain and work in the woolen business, assisting to start with, and joined, like many people, the Home Guard. And so he got involved in Huddersfield and Bradford Home Guard. And then by the time Churchill arrived in 1942 to give a speech in Bradford, he was second in command in the Home Guard for security in Bradford, and this was a thrilling for him. And then moving on from that, his military career in Britain developed. So with the Allied Forces Act in 1943, he could be an equal with the British forces, and he joined the Intelligence Corps as an intelligence officer and was sent to St John's University in Cambridge for training, and then was moved to Kempton Park Racecourse, that was the head of the intelligence interrogation unit, where his various duties started in Britain. So he was sent back then to Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, to round up prisoners of war. And because of the languages he spoke, he could get groups of people to attention in the barracks and keep order. When the prisoners were moved to Kempton Park, he, together with colleagues, would complete interrogations to identify whether someone was a patriot or a traitor. And it was 1945, with the Allied American and British force, he moved into the countryside with a group managed by Eisenhower. There he was in charge of Eisenhower's map room. And what they would do is every day update the positions of the Allied and the enemy forces and identify where there were risks and opportunities in their movement in Europe. And so all the intelligence officers would be there to identify the situation. In 1946, he received a telegram from the Red Cross informing him that his parents had perished in a concentration camp. And so he was given compassionate leave to then go and investigate what had happened and go back to Olomouc.
How did this affect him?
I've always been really impressed with his ability to manage and carry on. Somehow he could separate himself from the reality of it and keep going. He really believed that he needed to make a future for himself. So going back to Olomouc in 1946, he found out more information about what had happened, and he bumped into an old friend of his, Kurt Engelmann, and they then spent 2 days together explaining what had happened to each other. Kurt had left Olomouc and gone east to Russia, and my father went back to Britain and continued in the woolen trade and applied and received his naturalisation, and so therefore is no longer a refugee. And for him this was a very important moment, and he really carried on with normal life.
Your father decided to write down his life story.
Yes.
Did you find something surprising in it?
He would, as an older man, find it difficult to sleep at night and would write his memoirs and hand me papers to type up and hand back. And through this process, I learnt a lot that I had never known, and it gave us an opportunity to talk about what was happening. And I suppose the role he had in intelligence and the interrogation, probably because of the 50-year rule, he never really talked so much about it. And then it really sunk into me that what he had been through and what change he had lived through. And so this book, spanning the century, an ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances, affected the whole of Europe.
You yourself, you studied business and later worked for Visa International?
Yes. So my work took me around Europe. I hadn't got to Czech Republic, but I'd worked with Czech banks. They were opening up their ATM networks to accept international visa cards, and it meant that the tourism was starting.
In 2019 you came to the Czech Republic to discover more about your grandparents.
Yes, we arrived in Prague and did some normal tourist things and then travelled to Olomouc. So we arrived in Olomouc and met Peter, who is the chairman of the Czech Jewish organisation. But he was really helpful in connecting us with other people in Olomouc. So the next day he had arranged for us to meet Richard, who my father and his parents had lived in a flat in Richard's grandparents' house. And outside that house the Stoppelstein stones had been laid for my grandparents, and Richard had actually paid for those to be laid. It was amazing to meet him, and he was very happy to meet us too. The day after that, we met someone called Thomas. 1941, my father's parents were moved to a house outside of Olomouc. They weren't allowed to be within the town walls, and so they were in a house outside, and they were living with Thomas's grandmother. So he knocked on the door, and fortunately for us, Stanislav, the grandson of the original owner of the house, answered the door with his wife and graciously allowed us to enter and showed us around the house. And they even pointed out bullet shots on the outside of the house when the Russians moved in. I also learnt that in 1942, my grandparents and Thomas's grandparents were then moved to a school in Olomouc on the 3rd of July 1942. And then the next day, on the 3rd of July 1942, they were paraded or moved back to the Olomouc train station, where they were put on a transport, AAM, to Terezín, and many of the people perished in Terezín. My grandparents were sent to another camp because they were much older, Malý in Russia, where they finally perished. And so we didn't know any of this until we went there, not firsthand and not seeing the house and learning. And also what was really important for me was meeting people who were also impacted, which hadn't really happened up until that time. So it was very important to learn about this story. Later on in life, he did bookbinding, And in the craft guild that he worked, they would also print books. That, I think, represents what was important to my father. I really enjoyed doing this and reading books and studying with other people.
Do you feel that your Czech background has had a big influence on your life?
I think going back, realising the connections. It's interesting actually, the history, the culture, feeling European, very important for me. And the food, you know, visiting there and actually having the local beer and the local beef and dumplings and knowing, you know, the involvement as my father's father being involved with malt and beer production. I felt a very strong connection. Going back helped me really feel that I was a mixture. And actually in my dad's book, he always said he was in between. He was, you know, a mixture too. And I think lots of families from the war, you realise how many people were forced to move and change their lives. That Europe now is a real mixture of people, and it's important they all stick together.